I am seated in the courtroom with a front row seat, while Wendi Adelson is testifying in the case against her brother, Charles Adelson, who was charged with hiring hitmen to kill her ex-husband, Dan Markel. Behind me are the victim's parents, Phil and Ruth Markel, and the victim's sister, Shelley. The courtroom is packed, watching intently. Years earlier, in early 2020, I had published a video on YouTube, a video titled Top 20 Plus Reasons Why I Think Wendi Adelson Was Involved in the Murder of Her Ex-Professor, Dan Markel. In that video, I discussed the many apparent coincidences, as well as other circumstantial evidence, that point to Wendi's pre-murder knowledge of the conspiracy to murder Dan Markel and to her possible direct involvement in the murder of her ex-husband. As I am watching her testimony, there is a momentary break due to a sidebar conference. The judge and the lawyers scurry to the side of the courtroom furthest from the jurors to discuss an objection, and Wendi is all alone in the witness box. Wendi uses this opportunity to look at the jurors. She starts to intently look at them, spending time on each of them in an apparent effort to establish eye contact. Then, at some moment, she succeeds. A juror, a petite lady on the front row of the jury box, returns the eye contact to Wendi. Wendi seems to be trying to mesmerize the juror. Wendi has an expression of indignation in her face and follows it with a flirty smirk, a smile, or something in between. The juror smiles back and looks away. This interaction was obviously purposeful, from Wendi's perspective. It is as if she thought that she could charm the juror into finding her brother not guilty. Maybe I am reading too much into that moment, but I doubt it. I think my assessment was accurate. There are so many weird things about Wendi, Charlie, and Donna, and to me, this moment was significant. It reminded me of thoughts that had been circulating my mind back in 2020, when I first analyzed Wendi's involvement in the murder. We are now in 2024, and we have a lot more information about how the murder was carried out. So in this video, I revisit this question: what if Wendi did it? Before I go further on this video, please let me remind you that we do have a system of justice in place, and it is that system of justice that should deal with Wendi Adelson, if she was indeed involved in the murder. Furthermore, in this video, I am providing my analysis of the limited evidence available to the public. My analysis could, of course, be wrong. Furthermore, although her attorney has an open invitation to appear on my channel, I did not run the draft for this video by Wendi's attorney, John Lauro. He is welcome to come to my channel to respond, but he does not have to, of course. We all have the right to remain silent. Wendi has the same right. And she also has the right to confront the witnesses against her, if she is ever charged or sued in civil court. Let's get back to the question: what if she did it? And what I mean by this is not, what if Wendi killed Dan herself? That is obviously not what happened. I also do not mean this: what if Wendi hired the hitmen herself? So far, there is no evidence suggesting that she directly hired Katie, or Sigfredo, or Luis, or a combination of them. So here is what I do mean. What if Wendi did want her husband to be murdered and found a way to make it happen without her direct involvement? Most spouse murders are done by men, often jealous men who cannot stand for their wives or girlfriends to leave them. Recent Tallahassee examples include the murder of Penny Lucas by husband John Lucas, the murder of Rodrika Hill by long-term boyfriend Christopher Harvey, the murder of Samira Frash by estranged husband Adam Frash, and the murder of Shamaria Thomas by abusive boyfriend Travis Collins. Sadly, there are many more such examples. However, occasionally a woman will lead someone else to murder her husband. We have a nationally known example right here in Tallahassee. Denise Williams had her lover Brian Winchester murder her husband Mike Williams in December of 2000, on the day of Mike and Denise's anniversary. In that case, the actual killer, Brian, was Mike's best friend. However, Denise started an affair with Brian, and then, after Brian told Denise how, on a hunting trip, Brian saved Mike when Mike was trapped on something that seemed like quicksand. Denise suggested that Brian create an accident scenario for Mike, but that time Brian was supposed to let Mike die. That way, Denise could collect the life insurance money on the death of Mike, and later, Brian and Denise could marry and enjoy a rich lifestyle. Brian did end up killing Mike for Denise. The fake accident attempt, pushing Mike off the boat at Lake Seminole while Mike wore waders, did not work. Mike was able to get out of the waders after Brian pushed him into the lake. Brian adapted quickly, and he instead shot Mike in the face, killing him. Brian then dragged the body off the lake and put it in the back of his SUV. Brian drove his dead friend's body to Tallahassee and later hid the body at the end of Garner Road, near a secluded public boat ramp by Carr Lake. Brian later married Denise, and they got away with the murder for over 15 years. In his confession, Brian suggested that Denise manipulated him into committing the murder, using sex and the promise of a wealthy future together to lure him into committing this evil deed against a childhood friend. So what about Wendi? Did she use manipulation to get others to solve her Dan Markel problem? The divorce between Wendi Adelson and Dan Markel should have been an amicable one. Had Wendi handled the decision to divorce and break up the Bear family more gently, more wisely, there can be no doubt that the divorce would have been amicable. Dan Markel was not obsessed with Wendi. He quickly moved on, just like she did. Just like Wendi, he also had multiple affairs during the separation, and eventually, after the divorce became final, he seemed to have found true love with a New York law professor. Instead, the divorce started badly and quickly led both sides down a negative path. Wendi's family did treat her as a damsel in distress, as someone who needed the family to push her, to support her, as she stood up to Dan Markel. But was all of that a farce? Did Wendi want the drama? Did Wendi trigger Dan Markel to become over-litigious? It seems that she did, and he took her up on it. He fought back. The way she handled her decision to divorce him, the things she took away from the house while he was on a business trip in New York, the fact that she kept her new address hidden from him for weeks after she separated, all suggest that Wendi wanted to make Dan Markel mad, to make him feel as if he was being treated like an abusive husband, to make others see him as an abusive husband, and that therefore he must have been abusive. She took his bicycle, later claiming that Charlie bought it for Dan, so it was not Dan's, his tennis racket, whatever furniture she chose, etc., leaving the divorce papers at the nearly empty house. She had friends help her move while he was out of town, as if she needed to go into hiding. What would their tight-knit community of friends think? What would the law school's academic community think? Dan Markel must have felt the need to correct the misimpression created by how Wendi was handling the divorce. He shared with close friends that he thought that Wendi was going through some mental health struggles. This, in turn, got Wendi triggered as well. During the divorce, she continued to do things to trigger Dan Markel, such as keeping her engagement ring, a family heirloom of the Markels, a ring she promised to return to the Markels during her divorce deposition, but that she has never returned to the Markels. She also used the children against Dan Markel. He insisted on being a part of their lives during her time with the kids, and they agreed on Skype visitations. But Wendi often refused to comply with the agreement, suggesting that the kids were not interested in Skyping with their dad. In October of 2013, she failed to keep her agreement to attend the same Halloween party Dan Markel was attending. After building up hope in Dan that he would get to enjoy this fun holiday with his kids at a mutual friend's party. The triggering, the gaslighting, went on and on. Sadly, Dan Markel did not realize what was happening, and soon they were triggering each other, although most of the triggering seemed to come from Wendi. Dan Markel tried to use his brilliant legal mind and the justice system to teach Wendi a lesson, a big mistake in my opinion. While he won the major legal battle in the divorce case, the denial of Wendi's motion for permission to relocate to South Florida with her boys, in the end, both of them were big losers in the court system. Both got totally entangled in the needless litigation. Dan got himself deeply entangled in the litigation, writing motions and memorandums himself, instead of letting the lawyers control the litigation. I have seen it before. I have seen another lawyer at a great law firm make the same mistake. That lawyer ended up losing his job because he mostly stopped doing his law firm's work, and instead he was heavily invested in doing his own legal work in his own divorce. That lawyer's mood and work were deeply affected, and although he was liked and was a good lawyer, the partners eventually put their foot down and fired him, probably for his own good. Dan Markel's academic performance was likely also affected by his deep involvement in the divorce's legal battles. Those battles were also detrimental to the overall interests of the broken family, particularly the two boys he and Wendi had together, with each side spending a lot of money on lawyers and a lot of time on needless litigation, and with each side dealing with the stress caused by the litigation. Dan and Wendi had been a very popular couple and family, the so-called Bear family. But with the nastiness during the split, even their friendships were suffering, with many close friends sickened by the Team Danny and Team Wendi dynamic of the split-up of the Bear family, and with many loyal friends wasting hours of their time listening to Wendi or Dan complain about the other. Dan and Wendi's families must have suffered as well. Wendi's family in particular had reason to be mad. To them, fueled by whatever Wendi was reporting to them, Dan must have seemed like a monster, a controlling guy who could not stand the fact that Wendi wanted a divorce, a guy who wanted to hurt their princess. Given their own deep involvement in the divorce, however, it would seem that Harvey and Donna, the two that were mostly involved in Wendi's divorce, should have known that Wendi was triggering Dan. They were not wise. No one was wise. The Adelsons likely could have gotten what they wanted with Honey, but instead they tried to hurt Dan, to humiliate Dan, and he fought back. Whatever suffering fell upon the Adelsons during the divorce and post-divorce litigation was in large part their own fault as well. Wendi, of course, had a huge role in creating this nastiness that ultimately led to the murder of Dan Markel. I do not see her as a damsel in distress. I see her as a well-educated woman, a lawyer, a published author, a person who is in control of her own life and of her own actions. No one else should be blamed for Wendi's handling of the divorce. Ultimately, she was in charge. However, it seems that she let her deep hatred for Dan Markel, which she wanted others to share, to control her decisions. The nastiness of the divorce was a self-fulfilling prophecy. At her own interrogation, on the day of the murder, Wendi repeated the theme many times that someone might have done the murder for her, thinking that somehow killing Dan Markel would solve her problems. She often says the right thing during her interrogation, but the impression she gives is the opposite of what she says. Although she describes what happened to Dan Markel in a negative light, the constant low blows about Dan Markel suggest that she thinks the opposite is true, that now all of her problems have been solved. Even when talking about her kids and her desire to allow Dan Markel's family to have a relationship with them, she throws in an insult at them, calling the Markels difficult and suggesting that they are not very interested in having a relationship with the kids. We now know the opposite to be true. The Markels have fought hard to be a part of those kids' lives, and even to help other grandparents in similar situations be able to see their grandkids. During the interrogation, Wendi was already telling the victim's advocate, Sarah Latour, how the kids would not longer have restrictions and could eat all the ice cream they wanted, using the sudden loss of their father as justification for this new, freer lifestyle. What do Wendi's actions after the murder tell us about how she felt about it? She immediately moved to a South Florida luxury high-rise with the boys. She dishonored Dan Markel's wishes on how to raise the boys. She changed the boys' names from Markel to Adelson, even changing a middle name that was partially in honor of Dan Markel's family. She collected the money that was being litigated in the post-divorce litigation by filing a claim against Dan Markel's estate. She enjoyed the financial fruits of the murder. She used every opportunity she could to continue to destroy the legacy of Dan Markel and to assume a position of victimhood. Less than 1 year after the murder, Wendi took a writing course. Yeah, a published author took a writing course, and the course had an accompanying podcast. Wendi gladly participated in the podcast, using it as opportunity to further trash Dan Markel, making the joke that she did not know whether to call him her late ex, because it sounds like latex, telling her side of the story about the split and the reason for it, telling the world that she never loved Dan Markel, and even telling the world that her own mother, Donna, thinks that Donna, is stupid, then correcting her by saying that Donna won a spelling bee in middle school. During her police interview on July 18, 2014, Wendi admitted to being passive-aggressive, so I think it is safe to say that the things she was saying during the podcast were meant as insults to Dan Markel, and possibly even to her own mom. In my opinion, what Wendi meant when describing her mom Donna during the podcast was that her mom actually is stupid, in Wendi's opinion. With respect to her boys and the Markels, she did give some early access to the Markels, who occasionally visited South Florida from Canada. But as soon as suspicions arose about the Adelsons' involvement in the murder, Wendi used an excuse in email from Ruth Markel to prosecutor Georgia Kappelman about making arrangements for the boys in the event Wendi was arrested, and cut off all contact between the boys and the Markels for many years. Then later, starting with the first trial and in each trial, Wendi lied in court, intentionally or not, about many things, such as about driving on Trescott hours after the shooting, and about the status of her relationship with Dan Markel near the time of the murder, calling it, at the most recent trial against her brother, copacetic. She also used her stage in court, while testifying as another forum to denigrate Dan Markel and his family, something that she seems to love to do. Let's take a step back from that moment in the courtroom, where Wendi seems to be trying to manipulate a juror into liking her and, by association, her brother Charlie. Was she trying to manipulate the juror? Is manipulation the way Wendi Adelson solves her problems? Jeffrey Lacasse seems to suggest that Wendi Adelson was highly manipulative. What if Wendi did the murder, indirectly, via manipulation? What if she did it in the following manner? She manipulated Dan Markel into acting like the jerk he was not, triggering him, gaslighting him into becoming an over-litigious zealot focused on defeating Wendi in court. She manipulated her family and friends to hate Dan Markel, to believe that Dan Markel was mentally abusing her, that he was holding her imprisoned in Tallahassee just to make her life miserable, and that he would never stop harassing her until she was destroyed. She manipulated her parents and brother Charlie to think that Wendi was a damsel in distress who was becoming more and more depressed because of the so-called abuse from Dan Markel. She manipulated her parents and brother to think of Dan Markel as an endless problem that would ruin their lives and the lives of Wendi's and Dan's boys, and invited them to think of solutions for this problem. She manipulated Charles Adelson, perhaps by liking and repeating his joke, into thinking that a hitman was indeed a viable and good option for getting rid of the Dan Markel problem. She manipulated her mom to hate Dan Markel so much that she, Donna herself, started to feel depressed about life with Dan Markel. Knowing that Donna's misery would be spread among the family until the cause of her suffering, Dan Markel was dealt with, and that her family always found a way to appease Donna, no matter what it took. Could someone be guilty of murder for creating circumstances where the murder by someone else became predictable? Can someone be guilty of murder for making others think that something like a murder would be the only solution to a perceived problem? Can someone be guilty of murder by telling them they wanted the murder done without telling them they wanted the murder done? It seems that based on Wendi's actions and manipulation, Charles Adelson, possibly with the help of Donna, did put in place a conspiracy with the aim to have a South Florida hitman kill Dan Markel. The conspiracy worked, and Dan Markel was murdered. Although so far there does not seem to be any publicly known evidence conclusively showing Wendi's direct involvement in the murder. The evidence suggests that Wendi was, at a minimum, kept in the loop. That perhaps she did not become aware of all of the details, but she certainly must have known that the hit was going to happen, and when it was going to happen. During the June 4th attempt, the first trip to kill Dan Markel, Wendi had the kids and was home with boyfriend Professor Lacasse. She then asked Lacasse to drive to a gas station for some medicine. The same evening when there were two hitmen intent on killing Dan Markel, driving around in Tallahassee, using a vehicle similar to Lacasse's Nissan Sentra. If the murder had happened that night, would Lacasse's phone have pinged in the same cell phone tower within the range of Dan Markel's house? It seems likely. What about all of the so-called coincidences and evidence tying Wendi to the murder? Although some of these could be pure coincidences, how many coincidences would a jury be inclined to accept as mere coincidence? There are so many coincidences. One begins to think that Wendi actually wanted to be a suspect, wanted her brother and family to be a suspect, perhaps that she wanted others to think that she was involved in the murder without being able to prove it. Here are some of those coincidences and other related circumstantial evidence. A few weeks before the hitman's first trip to Tallahassee, in the post-divorce case, Wendi's attorney withdraws, allegedly because Dan Markel was also seeking sanctions against her, and this results in the cancellation of Wendi's deposition and of the hearing where the court was going to decide who would win the post-divorce battle. For the first time ever, just a couple of days before the murder, Wendi and her boys had a conversation about death. Wendi had not talked to Dan Markel for days, using laryngitis as an excuse. She had been avoiding meeting him in person for days, maybe because she knew he was a marked man. But yet, on the morning of his shooting, she had been in communication with him, and he even requested a meeting with her to discuss the matter. She repeated Charlie's hitman joke that morning to a repair guy from Best Buy who was looking at the TV that was the source of Charlie's hitman joke that He bought her that TV instead of getting her a hitman to kill her ex-husband because the TV was cheaper. And yeah, that TV was being looked at for a potential repair that same morning. Later, after an FBI operation in 2016 intended to get the co-conspirators to talk, Donna refers to a potential extortion attempt, with the bad guys asking for $5,000, as this TV is going to be $5,000, with the TV apparently being used as code for paying the hitmen. She is having lunch with a child psychiatrist as her children's father was fighting for his life after being fatally shot, before she supposedly learned of the murder. I wonder if the conversation with her two boys about death conveniently came up during that lunch as well. She wears an owl t-shirt on the day of the shooting, and an owl is not only an omen of death in some cultures. It is also the meaning of one of the convicted hitmen's nickname. In another language, tudo equals owl. She drives by the scene of the murder less than 2 hours after it happened, on her way to buy a drink that sounds like bulliet as a gift for a stock the bar party just a couple of hours after her ex-husband took 2 real bullets to the face. If she drove to the scene with knowledge that a murder was going to be happening, what did she hope to see? Did she know that it had already happened? Was she trying to get confirmation that the murder was done? Did she want to be the person who found the body, using the planned meeting to discuss the boys' new school as her excuse for stopping at the house when she was in the area on errands? Or did she want to make herself a viable suspect in the shooting to distract the police from the real killers, or for other reasons? What about her police interview and her strange behavior there? Certainly she acts like one would expect a guilty suspect to act, talks too much, gives too many uncalled-for explanations and details, seems to fake emotional outbursts. Of course, people react to tragedy in different ways. Such tells are never conclusive. However, her behavior in the interrogation room is similar to others who have been convicted of similar crimes, like Dalia DiPolito and Mark Sievers. At some moments during the interrogation, if you close your eyes and just listen to her while she's alone in the interrogation room, hyperventilating, it seems that she is mirroring Mark Sievers' weird behaviors when he was alone in the interrogation room during his second interrogation. If you are not familiar with these two individuals, Dalia was convicted for hiring a hitman before the murder happened, and Mark was convicted for hiring 2 hitmen to travel to Florida and kill his wife, Dr. Teresa Sievers. Unfortunately, Mark's conspiracy worked, and Dr. Sievers was brutally murdered when she arrived home from a family trip, while the rest of the family stayed behind to vacation for a few extra days. Wendy's interrogation room behavior towards the detective and the victim's advocate is also bizarre. At times, she seems to be flirting with both the detective and the victim's advocate. To be fair to Wendi, I don't blame Wendi for talking about other potential suspects. Wendi was being asked about who might want to have harmed Dan Markel, so there is nothing bizarre about her musings about potential suspects, assuming she was innocent. But much more weird is her constant questioning of whether she is a suspect, her revelation of facts that would make her a suspect, and her revelation that she did not shower or wash her hands since before lunch, thus allowing for a GFR test to prove that she was not the shooter. How about the fact that she threw Charles Adelson under the bus from the start? Minutes into the police interview, after being told that Dan Markel was the victim of a shooting and would not survive, Wendi talks about her brother Charles's hitman joke, even mentioning a conversation she had about it with the Best Buy's Geek Squad guy. She also expresses several times that she was worried that someone did the murder for her and expresses concern that her family might have done it. As we know now, her family was involved in the murder. At a minimum, Charles Adelson was involved. He has already been convicted. Did Wendi want Charles and Donna to be suspects from day one? Did she want her family to be caught, maybe as some sort of revenge or punishment for their meddling in her life and their underestimation of Wendi's greatness? That also seems quite plausible. There are other possibilities, of course. She may have been trying to get ahead of the evidence, to lessen its power, under the assumption that cops would eventually learn about Charlie's sick joke. She may have also been trying to appear innocent, cooperating fully and even naming her own family as suspects, in the hope that she would not be seen as a suspect. What about Professor Lacasse? She seems to have used Professor Lacasse in many ways. First, perhaps, to trigger Dan Markel, that she was dating a guy that looked a lot like him. Then it seems plausible that Professor Lacasse was being set up as a potential patsy, or, at a minimum, as an additional viable suspect to waste the police's time and to distract the police from the real killers. From his testimony, It seems that Wendi was both promising the world to Professor Lacasse, while at the same time she seemed to be trying to make him jealous. And how convenient, of course, was that breakup during the week of Dan Markel's murder, just as she was about to suddenly move away to South Florida. At Charles Adelson's trial, attorney Dan Rashbaum pointed out that it was not Wendi, but her friend Jane McPherson, who reported Lacasse as a potential suspect during Wendi's police interview. Remember that Wendi was allowed a visitor during her police interview, and that visitor was her friend Jane McPherson. And Jane did indeed suggest Lacasse as a suspect, and did so before Wendi ever mentioned him. However, anyone who has watched the full police interview knows that Wendi Adelson also admitted to having gone for a walk with Jane and telling her all about her problems with Lacasse, describing him as a jealous guy, telling her she was going to break up with him due to his over-jealousy. If Wendi knew about the upcoming murder, she knew that there would be a full investigation and that she was going a suspect. She also knew, or should have known, that someone like Jane McPherson would be interviewed by police. Or maybe thought it would be smart if Jane would come up with Lacasse as a suspect on her own, and Jane would either contact law enforcement or would tell her to contact the police about Jeffrey Lacasse. It is quite plausible that she wanted suspicion on Lacasse to come from someone else first. It seems plausible that Wendi successfully manipulated her friend Jane into reporting Lacasse as a viable suspect. In other words, did Wendi throw Lacasse under the bus without directly throwing him under the bus? Then there is the call from Wendi to her parents, in the interview room, with victim advocate Sarah LaTorre within earshot, able to listen to their conversation. If Wendi really suspected her parents, but did not want them to face legal consequences from their involvement, why would Wendi call them from the police interview room? Was she so naive not to know that she was being recorded? Was she so naive to think that if Donna responded in a celebratory mode, and Sarah heard it, that information could be used against the Adelsons? Was this a pre-planned call? Or was this even more bizarre, another attempt to get the Adelsons caught? The pre-planned call seems plausible. They may not have planned a call from the interrogation room, but it seems plausible that if Wendi and Donna both knew about the murder, Wendi might have told Donna to expect Wendi not to be alone when she first called to report what happened. Even if the call was not planned, Wendi might have also be using reverse psychology, thinking that if she took the risk to call her parents to let them know what happened in the presence of Sarah LaTorre, knowing that her parents might have been involved and might reveal their role during the call, that she would be perceived as being helpful to law enforcement, and therefore as uninvolved in the murder. The alternative scenario, that of Wendi making the call in the hopes that her family would be caught, seems less likely, but it remains a possibility as well. Defense attorney Dan Rashbaum, at Charles Adelson's trial, tried to ridicule the state's supposed theory that Wendi was involved in the murder. He suggested that Wendi could not have been involved in the murder because she had made many plans for Tallahassee in the weeks and months ahead. Really? Would Wendi have been so dumb as to stop making Tallahassee plans to telegraph so openly her involvement in the murder? That would have been too obvious. What else did Dan Rashbaum say? Oh yeah, none of the things Donna suggested they do to convince Dan Markel to let Wendi out of her Tallahassee prison were illegal, that they even consulted with a lawyer about their plan to offer Dan Markel $1 million to let Wendi move to Tallahassee. Really, Dan Rashbaum? Are the Adelsons so dumb that they would put their plan to murder Dan Markel in writing, in emails? Come on. Even more than Charles and Donna, Wendi had the motive and the opportunity to cause the murder of Dan Markel. Wendi had motive. She hated Dan Markel. She was annoyed by his reaction to how she handled the divorce, to his exercise of control over the kids and over her life, forcing her to stay in Tallahassee, where she did not want to be. Wendi also received huge financial benefits from the murder, from government benefits and beyond. For example, their July 2013 marital settlement agreement made limited provisions for child support from Dan Markel. There was no set amount. Dan Markel had to pay 65% of mutually agreed expenses for daycare and schools and extracurricular activities. Each was to pay for the expense of raising the child while each child was in their care, and they shared the kids 50-50. He was to provide health insurance to the kids, and Wendi was to provide dental insurance to the kids. Dan was to pay 65% of uninsured medical and dental care expenses. After the murder, Wendi had full control over the kids, received thousands of dollars in government benefits, and benefited from contributions towards the expenses of raising the children through life insurance benefits and estate distributions for her boys. As noted above, the amount in dispute during the divorce litigation was resolved in her favor due to the murder. She collected the monies from Dan's estate. There was no longer a need to spend time and money on litigation against Dan. The murder was a huge windfall for Wendi. Huge. No more kosher diets, no consulting with Dan about schools, daycare, extracurricular activities, no more forced Skype sessions with Dan and the kids, no more drama about failure to comply with Dan's wishes about the kids. Wendi had the opportunity. She could easily manipulate those who loved her to think ill of Dan Markel and to feign injury from his actions. I believe Wendi when she now says that she did not fear disbarment or severe repercussions if Dan Markel prevailed in his post-divorce litigation. However, what was she telling her family? Was she frantically telling her parents that she might lose her license due to this litigation? I think that there can be no doubt that Wendi fueled the fire, the rage in the Adelson family towards Dan Markel. Even if she wasn't the one to start the fire, even if Donna was the culprit in this regard, Wendi had the power to make everyone around her be reasonable. She could have made her family realize that their actions, not Dan Markel's, were causing her harm, were making her depressed. Instead, the opposite seems to be true. It seems that Wendi wanted her family riled up against Dan Markel. In the end, it seems that she, her brother Charles, possibly with her mom's involvement, to orchestrate a hit on her ex-husband so that Wendi could be freed from her Tallahassee prison. I would not be surprised if it was Wendi who manipulated Donna and Harvey to start spending some of their riches to rent an apartment in South Beach, a perfect place for her and the boys to move to as soon as the murder was done. Communications from that time introduced at trial suggest that Donna and Harvey were having a hard time with the move to the luxury condo, and that instead they were using it as a weekend getaway. The apartment at Continuum was rented for a very stiff price, just weeks before the murder, days before the first attempt trip in early June. Coincidentally, would there be a better place for the Dan Markel's boys to quickly erase the pain of the loss of their father? A prolonged stay on the beach and all the ice cream they wanted at a beautiful resort-style condominium complex with excellent amenities. Denise Williams was held accountable for the murder of Mike Williams, but it took the cooperation of her alleged co-conspirator, the person whom she supposedly manipulated, for her to be charged and convicted. In this case, if Wendi sort of manifested the murder of her ex-husband and her own family took up the cause of making her wish a reality, then it is unlikely that she will face justice in criminal court unless there is real proof of her direct involvement. So far, there is no direct evidence that Wendi was transferring information to Charlie or the killers about when would be the perfect time to murder Dan Markel on the morning of the 18th. It seems unlikely that Charles or Donna will cooperate with law enforcement and throw Wendi under the bus. Rather, Charles and Donna seem to be holding on to the extortion defense, that somehow the killers came up with the idea to solve the Adelsons' problem on their own, and to then force the Adelsons to pay under threat of violence. At trial, Charles Adelson testified that when she spoke to Wendi on the morning of the shooting, the 18th of July 2014, they spoke about relationship problems without testimony from Charles or Donna, tying Wendi to the conspiracy. The most damning evidence against Wendi comes from her words and actions during the police interview, as well as the testimony of Professor Jeffrey Lacasse, all of which suggest an active effort on her part to frame Lacasse for the murder, something that would be in furtherance of the success of the conspiracy. Possible theories could include that Wendi knew about the murder and that she was intentionally trying to aid the conspiracy by helping the killers avoid justice. How? By distracting cops, making herself as suspect of the actual shooting, knowing that she was not the shooter and that there would be no evidence that she was, and by making Professor Lacasse a suspect. The counter to this argument is an obvious one. She served the killers to the cops on a platter. She told them about her concerns about her family. She suggested that a hitman was something Charles talked about, although as a joke. And alas, a hitman actually killed Dan Markel. She even called her family from the interrogation room, allowing an employee of the Tallahassee Police Department to listen to the call. And she did not report Lacasse as a suspect, and even spoke positive things about him during the police interview. Of course, some of these could have been efforts at what is called reversed psychology. When you do something that suggests a result, such as the Adelsons becoming suspects, in order to encourage the person on whom the technique is being used, such as Detective Isom in this case, to conclude the opposite, that is, that the Adelsons, and more specifically Wendi, must not have been involved, and that someone other than a hitman hired by the Adelsons killed Dan Markel. Let's not forget what she said to Professor Lacasse days before the murder, according to Lacasse, that Charles Adelson had actually looked into hiring a hitman the previous summer, in 2013. Assuming it happened, that was a risky move that could have derailed the entire conspiracy before Dan Markel was killed. Of course, she qualified her statement to Lacasse, according to him, by stating that Charles had looked into it the previous summer, in 2013. According to Lacasse, Wendi did not say it as if there was a present danger to Dan Markel, but she seriously confided to him that her brother was willing to arrange a killing against someone who had hurt her ex-husband. Was this just another coincidence? Another Freudian slip? It is, of course, possible that Wendi was told by Charles that he had really tried to hire a hitman the previous summer. It is also possible that she decided to share this information with Lacasse without knowing that Charles went ahead and hired a hitman, and that a hitman was about to kill Dan Markel in a few days. Maybe this was one more in a long list of weird coincidences. But again, how many coincidences is a reasonable jury supposed to accept as mere coincidence? For Wendi to be totally innocent and to not have known about the existence of the plan to murder Dan Markel, we would have to accept way too many things as coincidence. Most people see Lacasse as a hero for coming forward with a ton of information that was very helpful to investigators. Dan Rashbaum, Charles Adelson's lawyer, tried to ridicule Professor Lacasse on cross-examination for his failure to contact the police. In essence, Dan Rashbaum was trying to demonstrate that Lacasse was lying about what Wendi supposedly told him by suggesting that if she had told him what he says that she did, he should have gone to the police or warned Dan Markel. Lacasse should not be blamed, of course. He was not given a reason to believe that there was a clear and present danger to Dan Markel. That was a poor move by Dan Rashbaum, in my opinion. I am inclined to believe Lacasse's testimony. He also indicated that he had repeated what Wendi said before the murder to a friend. More interesting to me is figuring out what was Wendi's motive in giving this information to Lacasse. This seems to be another puzzling fact in this complex case. Was this reverse psychology too? Was she hoping that others would not think that she was involved in hiring a hitman? Because if she had been, why would she have given this detail to Lacasse? Was she as flaky as Georgia Kappelman suggested, where she could not control herself from going to the crime scene, and thus also could not hold this secret and had to tell someone? Or are there more evil possibilities here, such as that, consistent with everything else, she wanted her family to be suspected of the murder. She wanted others to know that she got her ex killed, through her family, without being able to do anything about it. Lacasse provided more useful evidence against Wendi. His testimony about her bizarre interest about his plans on Friday, July 18, 2014. Again, this could be another coincidence, but with respect to the many so-called coincidences, this one is one of the hardest to swallow. Given the fact that several of the rented vehicles for the murder trips resembled Lacasse's vehicle, and his testimony about the June 4 errand Wendi asked Lacasse to do for her when the hitmen were in town for the murder, as well as the evidence that Wendi may have manipulated Jane into reporting Lacasse as a suspect, there are strong indications that Wendi was trying to set up Lacasse as a patsy, as a distraction in the investigation. Wendi Adelson is certainly an enigma. There can be no dispute that, as Christopher DeCoste said in the start of his cross-examination of Wendi Adelson at Katherine Magbanua's latest trial, the murder was all about Wendi. Ultimately, we can only hope that the justice system gets it right, and that if Wendi was directly involved in the murder, she will be charged and convicted. But what if her involvement was more subtle? What if she only used manipulation to make it happen without actually asking anyone to kill Dan Markel? What if she knew about the murder, but did not participate in the murder? Could she be held accountable? Should she be held accountable? Without proof that Wendi actually wanted Dan Markel murdered, or that she directly participated in the conspiracy or in the murder itself, she won't be held accountable for the murder, even if she created the circumstances that led to the murder, at least not in the criminal justice system. She could, in my opinion, be held accountable for the murder as a crime against her children if the state could prove that she knew about the murder ahead of time and she could have prevented. One does not usually have a duty to report a crime before it happens, but there is an exception to this rule when there is a special relationship between the person with the knowledge and the intended victim. A maverick prosecutor, acting within the statute of limitations period, might have tried charging such a parent with abuse of the children, abuse resulting from not reporting another's intention to murder the other parent of her children. The Markels could alternatively seek some form of justice through a civil case for wrongful death, but it does not seem that the Markels will take any action against any Adelson so long as Dan Markel's boys live with Wendi. It does not seem that Wendi feels any guilt in association with the demise of her ex-husband. She seems to blame him for his own murder. She speaks as if Dan Markel got himself murdered, and that his murder and the attention it brought to her and her family is a huge inconvenience in her life. She portrays herself as a victim, while at the same time, she has done many things to erase Dan Markel from her life and from her children's lives. She retains the ring, and she retains the boys, the now Adelson boys, although thankfully, she has recently allowed the Markels to see the boys. So who won the war of the Adelsons versus Dan Markel? No one did. This has been a tragedy to both families, a much worse one to the Markels, of course, but a tragedy all around. Maybe Wendi knew. Maybe Wendi was directly involved. Maybe she masterminded all of it via manipulation. One thing we know for sure, the murder was all about Wendi, and unless she is a total psychopath, that must weigh heavily on Wendi's soul.
Hey, this is Mentor Lawyer. Let's go back to 2015. Less than a year after the murder, published author Wendi Adelson decides to take a writing class. Why? Perhaps she was planning to write a book titled If I Did It. Just like OJ. Or not. Who knows? Well, Wendi knows, and I'm pretty sure she won't be telling us why she took that course. Thanks for watching, Mentor Lawyer and Ladybug. Now, we're gonna give some shout-outs to our long-term supporters, members, and patrons.
Today we will be shouting out our junior partners. Jackie Swisher, 12x12. Brooke, Speaking in Code. Stephanie Schultz, Steph5280. Yanette Gomez, Go Georgia. Marcia Pridgeon, Courtney Gehring, Zulu Zeet, Margot O. Heffernan, and Misk. Thank you all so much for all of your support.